I was raised to kill him, not with anger, not in haste, but with precision. That's how they shaped me, day after day, year after year, as if my skin were clay and my heart merely a space to be filled with memories that weren't mine. I never saw him commit a crime. I was never present at the fall of our name, nor did I hear from his mouth the lies they said destroyed my family. But I grew up hearing the stories. I grew up watching his portrait burned on the concrete floor, under the cold eyes of the men who trained me. Every mark on my body, every callus on my hands, every forced silence during the nights when I just wanted to be a girl, all of it was dedicated to him. He was the reason for my hunger, the why of my exile, the face behind the absence of everything that could have been mine. He was the man I would one day find, and when that happened, I would be ready to smile, to get close, to pretend, and then take from him what he valued most. His life. Kaelith Arwenhart was a name that existed only within me. To the world, I was someone else, a common woman with a carefully fabricated past, an identity pieced together with fragments that barely fit. But no one suspected. I learned to be discreet, to move as if I didn't exist, to observe every gesture, every breath. I spent my youth infiltrating environments, revolving around power, decisions, and alliances. Each completed mission was another step toward him, and when I finally learned he was there, that he now lived on American soil, far from the political wars he left behind, admired by all as a reformer, something inside me tightened, not out of fear, but anticipation. This was my chance, the culmination of everything. I was prepared, at least that's what I believed, until I saw him, truly, for the first time. And nothing they told me seemed to match the man standing before me. There was no malice in his eyes, no arrogance. There was time, there was weight, and an ancient sadness that seemed to speak before he even opened his mouth. I should have been cold, indifferent. I should have remembered every phrase I'd heard for years about the monster he was. But in that moment when our eyes met, the world didn't explode in hatred as I expected. It fell silent. And in that silence, something in me broke, because there was no way to hate him the way they taught. Me, and worse, a part of me, the part that fought so long not to feel, wanted to understand, wanted to hear his side, wanted to know who he was when no one was watching. I never said this out loud, not even to myself. But in that first look, I knew I wouldn't be able to kill him. And that thought destroyed me more than any guilt, because for the first time, I was no longer just someone's weapon. I was a woman, standing before a man I shouldn't love, and who nevertheless had just become impossible to forget. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? The woman he destroyed belonged to another time, and I was just a distant echo of that loss. I introduced myself with another name, with a carefully rehearsed story, with a smile practiced in front of the mirror so many times, I no longer remembered what it was like to smile for real. He shook my hand with an almost disconcerting gentleness, and for a moment, I felt ashamed of the invisible blade I hid beneath my skin. The cruelest part of it all was this: I knew how to kill him. Every weakness of his had been studied, every step calculated, every flaw mapped. I could do it in silence, without leaving a trace. But what no one predicted, what even I couldn't anticipate, was what would happen when he started to speak. He spoke with pauses, like someone measuring their words to avoid causing more harm than they already had. There was a weariness in his eyes that both irritated and drew me in, because it wasn't the look of a tyrant. It was the look of someone carrying too many memories, who might have made mistakes, but hadn't forgotten them. He wasn't the monster of my childhood. He was a man. And that, more than anything, was what broke me inside, because I needed to hate him. I needed to see in him everything they taught me to destroy. But the more I watched, the less certain I became. He smiled rarely, but when he did, it was as if the room lit up. He had a calmness that contrasted with everything I'd been prepared to face. And when he spoke about justice, regret, rebuilding, it wasn't a politician speaking. It was someone trying to stitch, with wounded fingers, the holes he himself had caused. I began to get closer with just the right frequency to avoid suspicion. A question here, an exchange of ideas there, a chance encounter that inside consumed me with tension. Every word I spoke had two intentions, the one he heard and the one my handlers expected me to fulfill. And yet the more time I spent by his side, the more I felt the truce approaching like an uncomfortable whisper. He trusted me, not out of naivety, but by choice. And that unraveled me, because even though he didn't know who I was, there was something in his eyes, as if he'd already forgiven me for something I hadn't yet done. Every night, when I returned to the room assigned to me, I lay down and stared at the ceiling for hours. The script was clear: seduction, approach, execution. And yet, there I was, drowning in the pauses, in his small questions, in the way he offered me tea before a long conversation, in the silence we shared without needing to fill it. And doubt, that poisonous doubt, began to grow in me like ivy. What if he wasn't the villain of the story? What if what they told me was shaped to feed my hatred? What if deep down I was just another piece in a dirty game, while the man before me was the only one trying to step out of it? It was on an ordinary night that I understood the depth of the trap. We were side by side, looking at an old photograph he kept with a care that bordered on reverence. In it, there were faces I didn't know, but one in the background was my father, young, alive, standing next to the man I was supposed to kill. And in that moment I understood. The story wasn't what they told me, and the blood they asked me to avenge might never have been spilled the way they said. That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's face in the photograph hovered over me like a ghost. He was smiling, not like someone facing an enemy, but like someone sharing trust. Next to him, the man I was trained to kill had the same expression. No tension, no pretense. A real moment, lost in time, that now screamed within me with the force of a thunderclap, muffled by years of lies. It wasn't possible. It didn't make sense within the story I'd been told my whole life. They weren't allies, they said. My father had been betrayed, they said. He was a victim, and the other was the serpent. But what if he wasn't? What if it had all been distorted to turn me into a weapon? What if I was just another piece on a board where no one played clean? I spent hours combing through the files I had access to, cross-referencing dates, examining details, names, records. Small inconsistencies that I'd previously ignored for convenience began to align with the cruel clarity of an inconvenient truce. My father wasn't a martyr, and the man before me wasn't a monster. Both had made choices, and both had blood on their hands. Only one of them had repented and chosen to rebuild. The other, out of pride or desperation, chose to leave a legacy of vengeance, and I was the heir to that poison. The next day, I dressed as always, hair perfectly tied back, eyes steady, posture unyielding. Inside, I was chaos, but no one could see, no one could know. I met with him as we did so many times in silence. I sat across from him as usual, and he, as always, looked at me with that serenity that now hurt more than any accusation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say everything, to ask why, to demand answers. But my voice was stuck in my throat, crushed by the weight of everything that had collapsed within me. He noticed, of course he noticed, with that gaze that saw beyond words, beyond appearances. He didn't ask. He just served me coffee, as he did every day. And in that simple gesture, I understood what was at stake. It was no longer about carrying out a plan, nor about proving something to the men who raised me. It was about me, about who I would choose to be in the face of the truth. And above all, about what I would do with the love that silently, insidiously, desperately was beginning to grow inside me for that man. The same man who just days ago I was supposed to destroy. That night, when I received the coded message authorizing the final act, my hand trembled as I opened the envelope. The instructions were there, cold, direct, definitive. I was supposed to act, to close the cycle, and yet everything in me screamed the opposite, because for the first time I knew killing that man wouldn't be justice. It would be cowardice. It would be letting myself be used by a story that wasn't even mine. And more than that, it would be killing a part of myself that was finally alive. It was in that moment that I understood. My dilemma wasn't between killing or not. It was between obeying or being free. I burned the letter. Every line, every instruction, every contact number and escape route. I watched the flames consume the paper slowly, as if hesitating to accept that I finally was breaking the chain. When the ashes fell, I felt the weight of the entire world settle on my shoulders. But paradoxically, it was a weight that gave me back my spine. For the first time since I've known myself as a woman, a choice was mine. Not dictated by doctrines, by code names, by male voices whispering orders from dark rooms. Mine, and like everything that is truly ours, it hurt. In the days that followed, I didn't pull away. I kept seeing him. I kept listening to him. But something in me had changed. Every word he said now echoed in a different place within me. No longer in the mission zone, but in the truth zone. He spoke of losses, of mistakes that haunted him at night, of decisions he'd made with the best intentions, and that, even so, destroyed families. He didn't deny his guilt. He didn't defend himself with rehearsed speeches. He simply laid it bare. And that broke me again and again, because in that man I saw the courage no one ever demanded of me. The courage to admit not just the mistake, but the humanity behind it. One night, I walked to the porch where he often sat to think. I brought 2 cups of tea and a photograph. The only one left of my father, not the one from the files, one my mother had hidden, sewn into the lining of my dress when I was taken. I handed it to him. He looked at it with an intensity I didn't ask for, nor was I prepared for. He ran his fingers over my father's face, as if touching an old wound, and then he whispered a name. My real name. The ground opened beneath my feet. He had always known, maybe not from the beginning, but for long enough. And yet, he never tried to protect himself from me. He never pulled away. He never blocked the path between us. He allowed it. He allowed me to get close, to discover on my own, to ask my questions and face my own mirrors. Because he, in some twisted and inexplicable way, respected my process. And maybe, just maybe, he had fallen in love too. I fled that night. I ran aimlessly into the heart of the woods. I cried like a child. I cried for everything I'd never cried for. The stolen childhood, the fabricated youth, the loves I never lived, the fears that shaped me, and the certainties that now burned in ruins. I loved him, the man I was supposed to kill, and that love wasn't wrong. It was difficult. It was unlikely. It was painful, but it wasn't wrong. When I returned, he was still there, waiting. He didn't say anything. He just made space beside him. And in that silence, I understood. The war I needed to win was against everything that kept me from being who I was. They noticed. I don't know exactly when or how, but I knew the moment I entered the apartment and found the window slightly ajar. A breeze that shouldn't have been there. A curtain. I never left out of place. A subtle absence in the corner of the shelf where I used to hide a spare weapon. It was the kind of warning that isn't written. It was the kind of threat left for someone trained like me, with cruel elegance. They knew I had hesitated, and hesitation, to them, was betrayal. The following days were a silent vigil. Cars parked. For too long, figures in reflections, a constant yet absent presence following me wherever I went. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. The same one they taught me, and now it was against me. The men who once shaped me with promises of justice now watched me with execution in their eyes. I had become what they hated most, a woman who thinks for herself. I warned him. I didn't tell him everything, I still couldn't, but I said enough for him to understand. It was time to decide. He could flee. He had power, contacts, enough money to disappear. But he didn't want to. He looked at me with the same calm as always and said, his voice steady, "If I run now, I'll never be a man again. I've hidden too much in my life." That tore me apart, because I knew what was coming. We stayed together, not as desperate fugitives, but as people who, at last, decided to let love be greater than fear. Our days became shorter, more vigilant. We slept with the door locked, but our fingers intertwined. And every morning we woke up alive was a small victory, a small miracle. The tension was constant, but it was also intimate, because there, on the edge of the threat, we found the depth of what we felt for each other. Nothing reveals the value of what you have like the possibility of losing it. It was on a moonless dawn that the signs shifted from subtle to blatant. He received an envelope, no letter, just a dried flower inside, an old code, a clear sentence. She is marked, and you with her. Those men, the same ones who raised me, now wanted me to pay with blood for what they called weakness. And I knew. They didn't miss twice. We had to decide, not about fighting. There was no war possible against shadows so entrenched, but about disappearing, truly, about leaving everything behind, name, history, past, about tearing apart all the versions of myself that had been written by other hands, about being born again, this time not as a weapon, but as a woman, as a lover, as someone who, for the first time, was alive and willing to pay the price for it. He looked at me before we left. He looked at me the way he did that first day, with the same absence of fear, with the same complete presence. And I knew. What began as a mission became destiny, and the man I was supposed to kill was now the reason I chose to live. They came at the end of the afternoon. It was always like that, in silence, at the hour when the light begins to die and the shadows blend with the day's exhaustion. I saw them coming from the window, 3 men, none of them familiar, and that was enough. When the faces change, it's because the old names have been discarded. When there's no more dialogue, it's because the verdict has already been given. They didn't come to talk. They came to finish what I was supposed to start. There was no time for promises, no time for vows of eternal love. There was only the precise moment of decision. It's now. Elias understood before I did. He took my hand, like someone holding a thread about to snap, and said only, "Trust," and I trusted, for the first time in my life, not in an order, nor a mission, nor a plan. I trusted in someone, with my eyes open, with my whole heart. We fled as we'd learned to flee, with bodies on alert and souls in tatters. There was no heroism. There was urgency. Every step was a memory left behind. Every road a line burned on the map of who we once were. We abandoned the car on a bridge and continued on foot, along routes no one remembered anymore. We slept in, makeshift places with aching backs and fear whispering things on the walls. But we also laughed, because there's a strange joy in surviving, in having the chance to look at someone in the dark and know that even with everything in ruins, that person is your home. We lost everything, documents, stories, references, but we never lost each other. And that, as painful as it was to admit, was enough. For the first time, my identity wasn't a code, nor a disguise. It was a feeling. It was the way he looked at me when he woke up. It was the way I said his name, not with fear, but with tenderness. Elias, the man who once symbolized everything I was supposed to hate, and who now was the only truth I had left. The worst part was knowing I could never go back, not to the places I knew, nor to the people who shaped me. But the cruelest part was understanding that even if I wanted to, I wouldn't fit there anymore, because the woman I had been, the daughter of vengeance, the shadow dressed in silence, had died that night, in that escape, in that choice, and in her place, someone was born who still didn't have a name, but who for the first time was real. We lived in silence as if it were an old friend, not by choice, but by necessity. The house where we hid was small, forgotten among hills, surrounded by tall grass and time standing still. There were no neighbors, no past, no future, just the two of us and the present, a strange, fragile present stitched together by small routines. The sound of coffee being brewed, the rustle of pages turning in the late afternoon, the light touch of my hand on the nape of his neck when the nightmare returned. It was a life so simple that at times it hurt, because someone forged in war doesn't know what to do with peace. Peace, for me, was a minefield. At first I slept with a knife under my pillow. Then I moved the knife to the drawer. A month later, I took the drawer out of the room. When I realized it, I was sleeping curled up against him, as if the years of tension had dissolved into my skin. But even there, even among flowers growing outside and sheets that smelled of lavender, the ghosts still whispered. My father's face returned in dreams. Sometimes his voice said I betrayed him, other times that he was proud. The doubt burned like hot iron, because the truth is, I never truly knew who he was. I only knew that his shadow haunted half my life, and now I needed to learn to live without it. Elias didn't talk much about what we left behind, but I saw it. I saw it in the way he watched the horizon as if expecting to be found. I saw it in the way his hand trembled sometimes when he heard sounds that didn't match the calm around us. He had lost too, and unlike me, he had known the cost of loss for longer. I asked little, but I listened to everything. And in the silence between his words, I began to understand the weight of regret, and how it takes courage not just to ask for forgiveness, but to accept that it might never come. We cared for each other with the gentleness of those who know they could lose again. That's how the days passed, between the pain that reminded and the love that kept us whole. And in the midst of it, I began to recognize myself, no longer as the woman who almost killed out of duty, nor as the girl trained to obey, but as someone who chose to love, who chose to stay, who even with fear decided to live outside the role written for her. It was one afternoon while picking herbs in the garden that I realized. I no longer thought about them. The men who raised me, the orders I received, the promises of vengeance. For the first time, my mind was full of now, of the breeze on my face, of the smell of wet earth, of the sound of his voice calling me from the porch with a soft laugh in his throat. I had crossed a field of pain and reached the other side, and what I found there was peace, not perfect, not eternal, but real. Today, when I look at him sleeping beside me, his face softened by sleep and his hair now more silver at the temples, I realize I never needed redemption. I needed only truth. And it came, not as a lightning bolt or a grand revelation, but in small things, in the way he holds my hand without even noticing, in the comfortable silence that fills our days, in the peace that settles in me when I hear his breathing aligned with mine. I was shaped to kill. But what no one told me is that sometimes the hardest thing isn't taking a life. It's allowing it to continue, allowing yourself to live without guilt, without armor, without a script, allowing yourself to be light after being made of iron. There was never an apology, not from them nor from me, because some pains don't heal with words, only with time and with choices. Choices repeated every day, like mine, to stay, to wake up day after day beside the man who was supposed to be the end of my story and became the beginning of one I never thought I could. Right, our world now is small, made of damp earth, stacked books, simple meals, and mornings that taste of coffee and fresh breeze. No one looks for us anymore, and if they do, they don't find us, because we're no longer where we used to be, neither outside nor within. We left everything, everyone, the pain, the old names, the versions of ourselves we wore like armor. The name they once gave me, Kaelith Arwenhart, still lives in me, not as a burden, but as a memory of the girl who was almost just a blade, and of the woman who, against all orders, chose to love. I didn't save the world. I didn't avenge my father. I didn't destroy any empire. But I found peace. I found love. I found a man who saw in me what no one wanted to see, someone who could be more than what they made her. And that was everything. If this letter is ever read, let it be by the hands of the woman I was, the one who walked silently through narrow corridors with clenched fists and a heart gagged by promises that weren't hers, the one who trembled before her own fragility, but hid the fear beneath her skin as if it were steel, who believed that completing a mission was more important than discovering her own name. I wish I could embrace you, not to console, but to acknowledge, because everything you endured, every order followed without question, every tear swallowed in the dark, every rehearsed smile before those who never saw you, was what brought me here. I am made of your courage, but also of your exhaustion, of the moment when, even with everything prepared, you lowered your hand and saw in the eyes of the man you were supposed to kill something no one ever showed you: acceptance. You didn't fail. You chose to live, and living, my dear, is the most radical act someone like us can commit, because living demands saying no to the past. It demands loving without guarantees. It demands building a home with hands that only learn to destroy. And you did it. We did it. Today I sleep in peace, not because I won something, but because I stopped fighting against myself, because I found a place in the world where silence isn't punishment, but rest, where touch isn't a threat, but shelter, where love isn't a bargaining chip, but a daily choice. The world out there keeps spinning with its haste, its wars, its judgments. But here, where our hands meet, time moves slowly. Here, we are whole. If you're still trapped in the mission, know this: you have the right to be more than they expect of you. You have the right to shed all the labels, to let your true name bloom among the ruins. And if loving seems impossible, remember, love doesn't weaken you, it restores you. And if nothing else makes sense, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen. You survived. Now live. With tenderness and truth, Kaelith.